I'm sure the police get a lot of calls like, hey, there's a homeless person sleeping in the doorway or something. I'm just being stereotypical, um, and the police arrive, what can the police really do? Can they just simply tell the person to go somewhere else? How much authority do the police have?
Well, let me go back and give some historical background to that question, because, when I joined the department in 1983, we had much more latitude dealing with the homeless issue, but it really wasn't as much of a problem until after 1987, when Ronald Reagan signed in new legislation that essentially opened the doors to a lot of psychiatric facilities, letting the homeless who previously received care for mental, disabilities in the facilities. Now they were out on the streets, and it's just continued to become worse and worse. But initially, yeah, we would get radio calls, we'd respond, we'd move them out of the parks, we'd move them out of the driveways. They couldn't be in parks, disrupting people. They couldn't be in the doorways. And along with the homeless issue also comes the health issues, which is really a big problem, especially now. I mean, in the city of Los Angeles, we actually have a typhoid epidemic that related to some of the homelessness issue and spread through rats. And now we've lost our ability to even move them out of park benches. Courts have come down really particularly heavy on police departments in California, saying that essentially we have no rights to move them in a lot of situations, although some smaller departments have a little bit more latitude than LAPD. But we can move them, but only if we move them to a facility or move them to a shelter. Well, a lot of the shelters fill up and there's no room for them. And so that's why recently Mayor Garcetti spent $700,000 to put in some trailers for the homeless to live in. But that only services a maximum of 45 persons. And then they hang out outside these trailers, just like they used to hang out in the parks and like they hang out in hallways or entrances. And it's a real problem because, in my jurisdiction where I used to live, businesses had to lock their doors because the homeless would come into the store and become very destructive. They would scream, they would yell, they would break things, they would disrupt business, they would frighten people. So they would lock their doors.
But now those are the ones, Catherine, that have the mental illnesses. I just read today that there's a growing population of the baby boomers going homeless, and they said that it tends to be primarily the ones that were struggling when they were younger, and now that they're like elderly, they can't afford their homes any longer, and they also can't afford medical care, right? Which leads to the disease stuff.
That Reagan took, which was a big deal in the mental health communities, obviously that's my arena, is because they did that because there were so many people being locked up indefinitely when they had not done anything. They were harmless, but they were being forced to be incarcerated, basically. And so they realized that it was more humane.
Melody went out.
Than to force them being into incarceration like that.
Right, they were given legal guardianship and placed in mental facilities. But
yeah, but speaking of that, that may be why some people are not liking Pam Roach's approach. She's out there where you are, Lorelei. She's in, I think, Pierce County, Washington, and she just suggested that they open up some of the empty jail cells to the homeless, which, by the way, the warden or who runs the jails, he's very upset about that proposition. He says there's a lot of liability issues, among other reasons the homeless shouldn't be put there. But Melody bringing up, the incarceration, I would think they wouldn't like that idea either.
Right. And I think that, what you were saying about the baby boomers is correct, is that there's a lot of people who are now in this situation where they can't afford to live, especially in California, because the poverty level there is like $117,000, right, a year, which tells you that even if you have a job in California, it doesn't necessarily mean you can afford a place to live. And especially if you're a single person, if you're on your own, it's nearly impossible. I had a friend who attempted to live in LA for a while and just really struggled and was couch surfing and ended up on the streets herself and in shelters because there was no place for her to go, even though she was doing some working here and there. And I think that's across the board, across the country, that's true, because our wages have stayed stable, whereas our living expenses have gone exponentially higher.
Right. And I think someone earlier mentioned about tiny homes, right? Did you mention tiny
Yes.
homes were being used? But there's an issue with a lot of cities. They have ordinances that they have to get beyond. Sometimes it's not just an ordinance that's blocking tiny homes. Sometimes it's just their permit process. And I think in some of the cities now, I'm trying to remember where it was. I read it today, but there's a special rule that I think it might be Louisville actually, where they can declare an emergency like homeless situation, and then they can bypass that permit situation and they can build more homeless shelters. I'm not a big proponent of homeless shelters unless they're being used to transition them somewhere appropriate, because right now I know people that go in and out of those and they just use them as daily or nightly sleeping places, and they still don't have tools to improve their life. So
I'm encouraged by what's happening at Fort Worth. I posted the article to our group earlier. The mayor of Fort Worth has started a program where she's actually putting people into jobs. She's finding positions for people, and they don't have to be complicated jobs or jobs that and if they don't choose to show up that day, if they're not capable, it doesn't matter. As long as they're continuing to do some work, they give them a place to live and they give them some income.
Well, the other thing I want to go back to is the homeless shelters. I think one of the biggest mistakes we're making is that we're recognizing that putting these homeless shelters in residential neighborhoods near schools, near children, families who worked really hard to get into a good neighborhood, when we could easily be setting up these facilities in business centers, in these large warehouses that are no longer occupied. In fact, we could just roll in shower facilities, we could roll in cooking facilities, we could roll in beds, and we could easily move these shelters around. And I think, I know, Sherry, you're concerned about them coming in and coming out, but unless you take away their rights, then you cannot force them to stay in a shelter short of an arrest or legal guardianship. So, that's a difficult thing that officers face as well.
But my concern was actually that they go there and it's like a nightly hotel, and then they go out on the streets during the day. They just stay there at night, and then they come back, and they have a limited number of nights that they can stay in some places. So they're really still on the street.
Well, that's why they should have to take showers for food, and they should, have to get clothing, replace clothing, and they could get doctors looking at them to see, what their physical condition is. A lot of these people on the streets, they have cuts, they have viruses, they have open wounds. And this is somewhat of a family show, but I've worked a lot having to pat down a lot of the homeless, and they will, instead of being able to use a restroom, they just put on another pair of pants, and they have feces, just covering their bodies.
Speaking of showers for food, what did you think about that recent ruling in Florida where the fact that they even had a lawsuit about feeding the homeless? Fort Lauderdale passed a rule that they couldn't feed the homeless, and that went up to the Supreme Court.
And we want to encourage all of our viewers to also chime in today, because our topic is homelessness, and we have 4 amazing amazing women on our show. This is season 2, episode 2. We have Melody Brooks, melodybrooks.com, Monica Shimonik with momsunshackled.com, Sherry Palmer with Fixed Family Courts, and Catherine McWillie, who is the CEO of custodycalculations.com. So chime in if you have some input on these laws too. Go ahead, Sherry.
Okay, so there's a new case that passed that it violated the First Amendment. It was an organization that went by the slogan, food not bombs, and they were feeding people out on the beaches, and the city tried to stop them, and the Supreme Court of the United States said, you can't do that, it's First Amendment. They said it goes all the way back to biblical times, right? Jesus fed the poor, the pilgrims got together to socialize, and as an expression, right, they got together and they ate and they fed other people. So they declared that that was an expression, that was how they were conveying their message, that particular group. So it's a big issue about feeding the homeless, right? I've seen McDonald's kick the homeless out when somebody gives them money to eat food.
Well, I think that, again, I see the picture very different sometimes, and my perspective is different, not just from the enforcement standpoint, because let's face it, you're correct, there are a lot of families, and there's 1.5 million children a year on the streets. So we're certainly not saying that these children are, are terrible people.
But I get what you're saying, because they're stinky and they're dirty, and you got your kids in McDonald's, right? And they're coming in, and so it's offensive to the business. And so I like your idea about the showers.
And the the people who want to feed and contribute food, they could be bringing that to the shelters, because what happens is we are enabling homelessness on the streets. It's just, there was a 75% surge in homelessness over the past few years. And if we continue with those numbers, I mean, we're only going to be a few of us in homes, and everybody else is going to be on the streets. And now we're taking away some of these people's desire to support themselves, because we give them free food, free housing, free medical. And granted,
but if we don't, we end up with diseases like you talked about, the typhoid.
I don't think anybody. I mean, there are a few people who are severely mentally ill that prefer to live on the streets. It's more comfortable for them. But when you're talking about families, when you're talking about newly homeless, when you're talking about baby boomers who are homeless, those people have no incentive. I don't care. Living on the streets is a miserable, unsafe way to live. I have a friend who's been struggling with homelessness for the last 5 years, and it is not a good place to be. And no, there's not resources available. Food is not easily available. Mental health is not easily available. Physical health care is not really that available.
Right. So taking that away isn't the answer. Taking that away is not the answer.
What's interesting about the feeding the homeless is some people's view is, if I'm helping one person in need who may be mentally ill or who may actually need that extra meal and couldn't get to a shelter that night, isn't it worth risking that I'm enabling someone else? I mean, there are people, not everyone wants to be on the street. We've had people give up their pets that they've loved because they couldn't find housing in time and the pets couldn't handle being outside. So, I mean, there's all situations. Are you willing to stop helping all because of fear of enabling one?
The problem is what's putting them on the street. Okay, so we've talked about mental illness. We didn't talk about the fact that there's a growing population of elderly ending up homeless, driven out of their homes. They can't afford it anymore. They need medical care too. It's unsafe to be around the ones that are mentally ill. Catherine's established that. So we're not covering the core issue. What is driving the baby boomers now out on the streets to be homeless?
And also, like, public housing and stuff, what's the hierarchy of how does one determine who's going to get the public housing and who won't? Like, how do they even do that?
In public housing, there is, generally speaking, a 7 to 8 year waiting list, and if you're an elderly person, is that going to work for you?
And some of our viewers say trying to limit the access of food to the homeless, he believes, is incorrigible. In the USA, according to Treatment Advocacy Center, as 33% of all homeless people having mental health issues, and in 2009 it was only 27. He says that the people with mental health issues are struggling to even access these services.
And I worked in restaurants for 10 years. I worked in restaurants for 10 years, and the amount of food that's thrown out is ridiculous. And restaurants get a tax write-off for all the food they throw out. There's no reason why that can't be shuttled to a homeless facility or even just anywhere.
Well, let me tell you some of the problems that some of businesses, good-hearted, that have wanted to do just exactly that. All these movie sets with a tremendous amount of food after they do a photo shoot or a video or a movie shoot, they were contributing to shelters. They were contributing to facilities to get food to the homeless. And some of the food, somebody got sick on it. So what did they do? They sued the movie studios, or these people are attributing food. So they said, fine, that's an easy fix. And they stopped donating. So,
Yeah.
you know, that's the other thing, is sometimes with the best of intentions, we have the worst case scenarios. And,
But that's only California, right, Catherine?
okay. Don't even get me started.
So to me, it's economic and a political situation in many ways, because what's happened in our country is that the upper class, the 1%, is taking such a huge proportion of the wealth in this country, and the bottom portion is losing any ability to support themselves, and that's growing every year.
Yeah. And not taking care of our impoverished, we all know, is going to affect all of us, like the disease issue. It's not just typhoid that starts spreading, it's syphilis and other things that we practically eradicated. As your homeless grows, those diseases come back.
Well, and not only that, but, you know, we pour tremendous resources, you know, the city of Los Angeles, a lot of the big cities, New York, Chicago, and so on. We put toilets out in the Skid Row section, which is where a lot of our homeless are concentrated. And they started using those portable restrooms for prostitution purposes. So they took the porta potties out. And officers, you know, when we would pat down homeless, some officers became extremely ill from all the antibiotics that have been pumped into the homeless, you know, trying to get them healthy, trying to, you know, get them standing on their feet so they, you know, can at least maybe take care of themselves and get to shelters. They've developed this very strong strain, and it's, you know, it's almost weaponized. Antibiotics have become almost weaponized. And again, I know that I'm approaching this from a very different standpoint, but, you know, we do have families like you're talking about, Melody, but, you know, if we could address the problem more effectively, we could get better resources to the people first on the street, and then do a several prong approach. Like, for instance, you know, we have so many warrants in the system for the homeless. And the chief of police for the city of Los Angeles said our warrant system is being clogged by the homeless. And I'm saying, wait a minute, that is an opportunity for us to provide services against their will to a vulnerable population that's incapable of making decisions to properly care for themselves. So if we picked up the homeless on these warrants, we could get them into a jail facility. We could get them back into a healthy, you know, situation and provide more resources.
But would you be mixing them with the rest of the jail population? Because what if these were the elderly? Are they being mixed with hardcore criminals?
Well, again, you have these different segments. You have a lot of hardcore criminals, hardcore drug addicts, pedophiles, violent felons hiding within the homeless community. So yes, they do need to be separated. You know, we can run background checks very easily on the computer and identify criminal histories, separate them out, and we could be utilizing some of our military bases that are only partially used.
Okay, but you're saying separate them out, and I have a problem with that, because if they're out, then they either served their sentence, or you know.
Well, I'm saying separate them from the main jail population. If they're just
But why are you running? But you're running background checks, and here now this person who maybe already served their sentence is paying the price again. Are they going to be separated out into the criminal population just because they had a criminal background and now they're homeless?
Right, and a lot of the reason why some people, there's a population of people that are homeless because perhaps they got picked up on a ticket or they got picked up on a minor drug charge, but they didn't have the money to pay their bail. They didn't have the money to bond out. And so what ended up happening was that they would go into jail, they would then lose their families, lose their jobs, and come out homeless.
Well, listen, we just cannot do a perfect, it's not a perfect world. And we're not going to be able to do perfect solutions for every person, every community. And you certainly can't put somebody who's got a violent criminal history and put them into a nonviolent population, which for those homeless, like you're saying, that are still socially functional, we should be working on getting services to them first, and then also have a secondary and a third, process. So those with warrants, we have a legal right to hold them if they cannot bail out. And by the way, California has almost a no bail procedure in place now, so that's not going to be an argument. So, but if they have a warrant and they're nonviolent, they go to a certain facility that's set up, sort of like the drunk farms that used to be in every large city during the 40s and 50s. In the 40s and the 50s, they had huge farms, and they would farm and become sober. And that's how we dealt with a lot of the drunk cases that used to be so prevalent. Because for the homeless issue, we used to have alcoholics on the streets.
What about young adults who just failed to launch, or families who got evicted out of rentals and didn't have the money to get another home, so are just displaced? And they're not criminals, and they're not mental health are the worst of the worst.
Well, in some respects, how did each of us become successful? We had to work. And that, I hear a lot of times, it is tough because, look at how many senior citizens are working McDonald's, and those used to be jobs that kids in high school used to take.
You can't live on McDonald's. You cannot find a place to live if you're living on the McDonald's salary.
So
our wage is part of the problem.
I know, but that's, again, you're talking about trying to solve every problem. We have to start somewhere. And so people are, if they become homeless, they're going to have to reach out to family and friends. They may not be able to get an ideal situation, but that's why we should be able to provide some resources to the first line of defense, the first people hitting the street, but they have to work. I love that job article that you sent. The homeless, if they're getting money, should be working for it. In San Francisco, they pay the homeless $400 a month, and that's just to begin with. And certainly,
I think government is not always the solution to this. And that example with the group in Fort Lauderdale, I think if government stops prosecuting or villainizing private companies and nonprofits who are going out there to try to help them, we'll be a lot better off. So what? So they had a message, food not bombs, right? That's good. They're getting their message across and they're feeding the homeless. But instead they tried to violate First Amendment rights. They don't respect. So the problem I have is government agencies have very little respect for First Amendment rights, and they tend to attack the people that are helping the homeless, and we set up policies that prevent private individuals from helping them, like these permit policies, right? There's Glenn Gibellina in Florida. He sets up homes for the homeless now, these little tiny homes made out of containers. And I know they've had to deal with and get through permitting issues and things like that. So they need to allow people to help the homeless without putting barriers in front of them.
Well, I agree. Government should not be fixing everybody's problems. Each person, you have to have some responsibility put on the individuals. And, so I do agree with that, Sherry, but there also has to be some recognition that, and maybe some partnerships. That's what I'm in favor of. As much as possible, I'd like to see private industry more involved in this because, I ran the numbers. There's, if throughout the U.S., they're saying the numbers are 554,000 homeless adults, but there's 1.5 million children behind that. But at 554,000 homeless, at 15,555, which is what the breakdown is so far that Garcetti has billed it, we're looking at like $950 million a year, and that's, you know, and some countries are going to have more costs. Some
Which is way less than the $5 billion for a wall.
I think when you bring up that you mentioned that you want more government involvement, Catherine, and how $400 they get paid in San Francisco, but the thing is,
no, I'm not saying more government involvement. I'm actually saying less government involvement, but I'm saying that where the government can get involved to help, like the Warrants, providing housing, providing medical, getting them in a stable environment, controlling their environment so they can't drink, you know, or get drugs. So they can.
I think Catherine's saying more effective government response.
Right, because one of our viewers says that becoming homeless presents an issue in and of itself. The lack of an address alone restricts the ease of access to social services. And you're also talking about healthcare, which they have to go to ERs.
Well, I don't agree with that. First of all, there's free phones. Obama had that program with free phones. I don't know about you.
You have to have an address for that, by the way,
No,
Catherine. You have to have an address.
General delivery.
Free phone.
General delivery.
You can't get that. What do you mean general delivery?
So
that's only allowed for 30 days. General delivery.
Not to my knowledge. General delivery.
I just did it when we sold our home. It was only allowed for 30 days.
Maybe that's just in your state. Remember, California is very liberal.
But that's a federal program.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I do think that California has like probably the worst homeless problem in the entire country. Where you're coming from, Catherine, is valuable information because I believe that you're working with like the worst of the worst.
We are.
In Connecticut, where I'm at.
I thought that was Chicago. I'm going to have to argue that. I thought that was Chicago right now, actually.
Oh, yeah. They have the highest homicide rate in the country. So, yeah, you might be right. But most of those Chicago people are coming to California in the wintertime.
What about in your area, Monica?
So in Connecticut, homeless people are mostly like the displaced. I mean, I lived in Hartford for 2 years, and the homeless people in Connecticut are typically people who've been made homeless by like the family court or divorce or kids who didn't launch or moms who couldn't pay their rent. So my concern is that place people become as bad as Catherine is describing within 10 years or 5 years. Like, we don't want it to get to that point. It's easier to work with displaced people than full-fledged homeless people.
What's the differentiation between full-fledged homeless and displaced people? Because aren't both without a home? Are you classifying levels of homelessness?
Yeah, in my head I am, because like I see if you've been on the streets for 5 years, you probably lost most of your your friend circle from when you were not homeless. Possibly you may have lost touch with family. You've lost touch with what it's like to get up and go to work every day. And possibly I would think that being exposed to those elements would lead to mental illness, especially if you have like gangrene or scurvy or,
Yeah, and the likelihood of being assaulted physically, sexually goes up the longer you're on the streets, which causes you trauma, which makes you physically have more issues, which makes you have more stress, mental issues. The
what's the word I'm looking for? What's that word? The inertia, is it inertia? I think that's what I'm looking for. Like when it's been 5 years, I would think just being exposed to that would cause mental illness. And then you're kind of at the point of no return where you can't walk into McDonald's and fill out an application. So a lot of times displaced people will be like, well, I'm kind of staying with my mom, I'm kind of staying with my aunt, or they're storing their stuff in somebody's basement. There's still kind of a sense that this is temporary. So I think that's what I meant by displaced.
And I think people kind of blame them for that, don't you think, Monica?
Yes, they do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you feel that people on the streets are contributing to them not going to services to get back on their feet and be helped through every step of the recovery? Because we know the recovery process is more than just providing food for homeless. It's far more than that. And these services are created in hopes of trying to guide them through getting back on their feet in every aspect. Are they saying that people feeding people on the street is preventing them from going to those services?
I don't get that a lot in Connecticut. Like, I'm not like an expert with this, but we're a very liberal state too. Possibly more liberal than California. I'm not sure. Maybe about the same. But
But you have manageable numbers. We don't.
Yes, Connecticut's really small. I mean, California. Even in Connecticut, we hear about how bad the homeless problem is in California.
I can say in Texas that the homeless situation here is horrid, mainly because there are so few services, unless you happen to be in Fort Worth, which, you know, is a whole different situation. But
even the homeless dog population is supposedly super bad in Houston, but a lot of people are blaming that the immigration is going to make this a million times worse, and that's why they're against immigration too.
But that's
Well,
not
that's an interesting point.
But that's not what happens, because they have communities that they move into, and they work on the farms, they work on ranches, they work in construction, and they have communities that support them, which most homeless people do not have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the three largest states for homeless issues are California, Texas, and Florida.
Wow.
And part of that's due to the weather.
So
yeah, I was going to say, in like right now, it's like not even 10 degrees out. So on really cold days, like today, I was walking to the appeals court. I always say, how do homeless people survive this kind of weather? I guess I hate to ask, Catherine, but like, do people die of the elements in your area of California?
Well, what we do is we open up our reserve centers. Our military reserve centers are opened up for the homeless anytime it drops, I think, below 58 degrees. It's compulsory. So they open up and sleep on the floors in the, and they may bring in bunk beds, I don't know.
And when it gets hot, they have malls that they can go to for the air conditioning.
They also go into hotels sometimes during the night, the lower levels. I've been in hotels, they had to lock the upper levels because of that in the winters. But Melody, when you were talking about the camps or communities that they set up for the immigrations and that should dispel a lot of people's maybe misconceptions of the immigration causing this, how come they don't do the same for the homeless to provide that for them as well?
Well, it's just that the people coming across the border find communities within that support within the Hispanic communities. It's not that people aren't setting it up. It's just that when you are a person out of work, which is most, or a person who's barely working, it's a whole. We don't have that. We just don't have that sense of community in the non-Hispanic communities.
But you know what? I disagree, because we have the Hispanic, communities. They go when they can't afford the hotels or they don't have any friends to go to, and a lot of them don't. They go up into the hills. They go, I mean, I've gone into underneath freeways looking for the homeless. I've drug homeless out of burned out vehicles in the alleys. I've climbed into abandoned vehicles, not just looking for homeless, but also for runaway kids. And, I have to get ladders and go up into the fire department to respond, to get up into the second and third and fourth story buildings because I can't find where the entrance was. And these, the homeless would be inside. They would barricade themselves in certain rooms, especially if they were women. They'd bring up a gallon of water with them and they'd shimmy up, this way or that way. So I really disagree that the immigration issue is completely taken care of in the Hispanic community, because everybody's coming across the different borders, the Canadian borders, the US borders, south of us. And they don't just all get absorbed into an existing community.
Here's an interesting statistic. I'm getting it from Forbes, and it says, by the way, the top 5 cities of homelessness is California's #1, New York's #2, Florida's #3, Texas is 4, Washington is 5. But here's what's interesting. New York, even though it's the second highest in homeless, it only has 5% of unsheltered homeless, whereas Los Angeles has 75%.
And Robbie says, looking at the past in terms of reduction of government involvement, we had Melody explaining the reasoning behind the closure of the mental health centers. However, looking at the expensive services required, the annual cost per homeless person to the taxpayer is about $40,500. He says, do you not believe that the investment in prevention rather than the reactionary care might help the issue overall?
That's a great comment. I mean, when I hearing this conversation, I'm just like, I mean, just as a human being, like, I mean, just the thought that this even happens. I think we're very good in our society. We're very good at pretending this isn't a problem.
Dehumanizing them.
Yes. I mean, gosh, maybe I'm enabling, but there's homeless people hanging out outside of the grocery store I go to in Glastonbury. I live in like the third wealthiest town in Connecticut, and there's homeless people hanging out outside that grocery store, and I always feed them through my window. I say, here, come over here, and I just give them food because like I can't just drive by them. But a lot of people in Connecticut are like that. We're very liberal, but we also probably don't have a huge homeless problem here, Even in Hartford, it's not as bad as what Catherine's describing. I just can't imagine, what you're describing, Catherine. Like, we don't really see that in Connecticut.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead, Melody.
To address the prevention issue, you have to address, obviously, the mental health system that is not available if you do not have funding. And in Texas, we don't even have Medicaid, right? So we don't have funding for people who are under 65 and are poor. They don't have access to mental health care at all. And if you could have some access to mental health care before they got on the streets, and maybe there might be an opportunity. In addition, is talking about the minimum wage gap being so low that people can't afford to live on minimum wage. So I think those two things together are a big piece of that problem.
Again, you guys, I see such a different picture, crawling underneath the freeways where young newborn children almost are being cuddled on their mother's lap while the rats run all over them. So truly, I have much more exposure to this. And also, just people sitting in a restaurant when the homeless go by and someone with mental problems that should be locked up stabs somebody. At a restaurant sitting down. It's just, and that's not a number that's dropping, it's a number that's growing, the violence within the community, because
I think we have to be really careful not to classify mentally ill people as all violent. Because
no, I'm not saying that, but
and also not classifying all homeless as mentally ill either.
Right. Well, but the thing is we can't preface every single statement to say, and I mean to include this, because I'm telling you, it's heartbreaking seeing some of these homeless with these children. And that's why I'm advocating first line of defense should be the most functioning people, while we use the warrants to get those people vulnerable who can't take care of themselves until they can get on their feet. And maybe they get released before they're functioning and they'll have to get recycled again or not.
Hold on, so you're saying first things should be addressed are the most functional, but then you said that the most dangerous are the least functional. Wouldn't that be the first ones to address?
No, because you don't want to lose the functioning to a larger group, to non-functioning, because Monica's correct. The longer, and so is Melody, they both make the comment, the longer you're on the street, the more you become victimized by the street process itself, the crime against you, and then it's so horrific that the recovery to become, normalized, socially capable of holding a job, being functioning, is reduced. So it's not one approach. It has to be multifaceted.
But I think the reason we don't see more people being classified properly, Catherine, is because we've got this stigmatized view of the homeless. And I guess we could say, because I grew up in California as well, I was homeless for a while as a teenager. I guess you and I could say we're a little more, like you said, we're more probably a little more jaded about some of the homeless, because I remember as a teenager when I was finally in a group home, one of my counselors telling me, don't feed them. It has nothing to do with the Florida thing, but don't feed them, don't give them money, they're drug addicts, right? And so I think we get a different impression of them, whereas like Monica, coming from a small area where the problem hasn't grown to that proportion, she's still, you know, she still has that, oh my gosh, I feel so bad for them, let me help them, right?
Well,
And that's how a lot of us are.
there's also the idea that, you know, because they're homeless, people start to dehumanize them and make them less. And also, I think there's either a perception or a stigma, or maybe there's a reality a lot of times that even the services treat the homeless less. And I would kind of be curious to hear how Catherine feels. Do the police treat homeless less, I don't want to say humanely, but if you kind of get what I'm getting at, and does the ER force them out and treat them less?
Let me just tell you that a lot of the homeless go from one hospital to another hospital to another hospital, either because of legitimate medical complaints or because they're passed out on the streets, on the curbs, in the gutters. They get transported to a hospital, and the hospital gives them food and drugs and a bed. So for them, that's a lifestyle. And it's hard to tell somebody who hasn't had a conversation, a normal conversation in a long period of time, to get them to follow rules. Again, the longer they're on the streets, the less functioning they become, the less capable they are of just following rules like stand still, sit here, don't move, you know, put your hands to the side. I mean, as simple as that sounds, you'd be surprised the number of homeless that are incapable of doing those things. They can't even stand still. They can't sit down. They jump up.
So what you're saying is that the staff and the organizations and the service providers are not treating them less because they're homeless, but because they've been homeless so long that they're not functioning to society's expectations?
I don't know that I would say functioning to society's expectations. I think society, everyone wants to help someone in need. But sometimes if you have somebody who has mental illness, or you have somebody who's a criminal, or you have somebody who's a drug addict, they do things under the influence that's very violent. And that, you know, the issue is also that some of the caregivers are vulnerable to being injured or hurt themselves. Again, we're not talking about the higher functioning displaced, like Monica said, but, you know,
I'm in total agreement that addressing the needs of the recently displaced is probably the highest priority, because that does prevent them from becoming long-term homeless and victimized. I think that's a really good point, Catherine. And I think that we have to address that. And we also have to address the drug addiction problem and seeing it and not criminalizing it, but providing the kinds of support that they need to be able to get healthy.
And I think that's a great all-around wrap-up. You have a couple more minutes if you want to say any final words on suggestions for how you would address things.
I believe that we need to invest in humanity, because a lot of people have the like it's not my problem syndrome, and we get this with family law too. They say, well, I'm not divorced, so this is not my problem. But you're going to be working in the community with a lot of divorced people who've been severely mishandled in the family court, so it is your problem. So like, if we're not investing in humanity, I actually like a lot of what Catherine's saying, like her solutions. You know, they're not perfect, but it's something. But we have to invest in humanity so that this doesn't become our problem. Do we really want our parents getting old and like living next door to a community of homeless people, you know, so like who's like hanging out in the streets? So it is everybody's problem. Just because we have homes doesn't mean that this isn't our problem.
And the other thing, people getting older is, and not having access to healthcare is growing.
And another thing that I didn't even think about this. Why am I not thinking about this? The safety, like what if you're a woman and you're in a shelter and there's like 6 men that are sharing the shelter with you, or you're a 14 or you're like a 18-year-old guy and I mean, just like there's no, is it safe?
No, those shelters are not safe.
No.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah, that's a human rights issue.
I think that I would leave this thought with everyone, and that is, try to think about the homeless in a different way. Don't look at them as villains. Yes, there are violent, dangerous criminals, but I'm not saying you need to go and directly expose yourself to them, but try to think of it this way. They all ended up there somehow. Let's try to get to the root cause about why the functioning and the healthy ones are ending up there, and why the unhealthy ones continue to remain on the street, so that we can come up with good, workable, effective solutions.
And then I'd like to just make a closing statement. I think we need more accountability with the money that we spend on these programs. I'm frustrated with the politicians who use this to grandstand, like Garrisay, who wants to run for president. I would rather he pay more attention to the city that voted him in place, and that he spend our money wisely, whether it's this issue or any other issue. If we had more accountability by politicians, we might have fewer homeless on the streets too.
Amen to that.
And I'd just like to add a short thing as well. Look up your organizations that do help with the overall integration for the homeless, and talk to them, reach out to them, find out if you see a homeless you're concerned about, let them know where they're located, let them know what you're talking about, and also ask them, what can you do to get involved if you are wanting to help and you're not sure if feeding them on the street is the right way. They're going to have the best suggestions for how to help on the street level. All right. Thank you, everyone, for stopping in and commenting, and we will see you next week, Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Guys.
Bye.